In the previous story, Ayanokoji officially transferred from Class 3A to Class 3C. That decision truly shook Class A, especially Horikita, who was still struggling to accept the reality that the person who had secretly supported her all this time was now in another class. Meanwhile, Ayanokoji began arranging his new moves together with Hashimoto, Morishita, and Ichinose. So this part will focus on the major impact after Ayanokoji's transfer, starting from Horikita's emotional shock, the confusion among the students of Class A, and how his new class began to judge his presence. Alright, without further ado, let us continue to part 2. Not long after Horikita and Chiaki left Ayanokoji at the cafe, Ichinose also decided to leave the place. The reason was that she already had an appointment to meet a friend. Hashimoto could clearly see how shaken Horikita was after Ayanokoji's departure. From there, Morishita also began to understand that Ayanokoji's transfer to another class was not an ordinary decision, but part of something that had been calculated from the very beginning. In truth, the transfer did feel extremely sudden. Usually, class changes were made before the new school year began. However, Ayanokoji was still registered as a student in Horikita's class until the opening ceremony ended. Only after that did he go directly to the school administration to complete the process of transferring classes. Horikita was after Ayanokoji's departure. From there, Morishita also began to understand that Ayanokoji's transfer to another class was not an ordinary decision, but part of something that had been calculated from the very beginning. This move clearly shocked many people, especially the students of Class A. Only Class C, and a few certain people, had already known about the plan beforehand. The rest were truly left in disbelief, as if Ayanokoji had deliberately arranged everything to look sudden. According to Morishita, all of this was part of Ayanokoji's strategy to shake Horikita's mental state. Hashimoto also felt that Ayanokoji's actions were too cold, as if he did not care at all about the mental condition of others. To sum up, Ayanokoji and Hashimoto walked toward the dormitory. When they arrived at the lobby, they met Hirata, who had apparently been waiting there. Hirata invited Ayanokoji to talk privately, and Ayanokoji followed him. Meanwhile, Hashimoto chose to go home first. On the way, they crossed paths with Sudo, Ike, Yukimura, and Miyake. Sudo immediately asked about Ayanokoji's class transfer, but Hirata quickly suggested that they find a quieter place so the conversation would not attract attention. After they reached a more private place, Sudo immediately let out his frustration. He could not understand why Ayanokoji had transferred classes without telling anyone. In the middle of that tense atmosphere, Ike suddenly started teasing him. He guessed that Ayanokoji might have transferred because he was heartbroken after being dumped by Karuizawa, and he was even convinced that Ayanokoji must have felt extremely embarrassed after being rejected. Amusingly, Ayanokoji admitted that it was indeed one of the factors. Ike immediately felt proud because his guess was not completely wrong. However, Miyake was not satisfied with that answer. To him, there had to be a much bigger reason behind Ayanokoji's decision, especially after seeing how devastated Hasebe was when she learned about his transfer. Miyake then explained that ever since Sakura left the group, Hasebe had continued to feel guilty. Back then, she had once pressured Ayanokoji too harshly to repair the relationship within their group. In reality, it was Ayanokoji who eventually helped Hasebe slowly recover from her guilt. Even now, Hasebe still had not properly thanked him. Hirata also admitted that he had once been saved by Ayanokoji. When he faced a serious problem and felt that he could no longer continue his school life, it was Ayanokoji who helped him endure. However, ever since the exam that ended with Sakura and Maizono leaving the school, Hirata's trust had begun to waver. He started to feel that Ayanokoji could no longer be fully relied on, and he even questioned whether Ayanokoji was still truly on their side or not. In the end, all the students of Class A were now truly confused by Ayanokoji's transfer. However, Ayanokoji admitted that this was exactly the kind of situation he wanted. He had deliberately created confusion. Class C, which had been left behind by Sakayanagi, was in a state of crisis, and Ayanokoji offered to help them. In return, Class C agreed to pay the cost of his class transfer. That statement left everyone speechless. They had never expected that Ayanokoji himself was the one who had offered himself to Class C. Ike became even more confused about why Class C was willing to pay such a high price for Ayanokoji, even though, in his opinion, there were still many other students who seemed more suitable. Yukimura also could not understand that decision. He asked for a more detailed explanation, while Ike still seemed to have a hard time accepting the reality. On the other hand, Sudo began to realize that this could become a serious problem for Class A. To him, Ayanokoji was an extremely important person, even if not everyone understood just how big his role had been all this time. Hirata then confirmed that the class transfer was entirely Ayanokoji's own decision. There was no specific problem in the class that forced him to leave, because Ayanokoji had chosen that path of his own will. After hearing that explanation, Hirata finally had no choice but to accept it. If that decision truly came from Ayanokoji himself, then there was nothing more they could do. However, Sudo still looked extremely upset. He even thought that if Ayanokoji showed even the slightest regret, he would try to gather points to bring him back to Class A. Meanwhile, Ike, Miyake, and Yukimura remained silent. Since they did not fully understand Ayanokoji's abilities, they might have felt that spending so many points for him was not a reasonable decision. In the end, Hirata suggested that they end the conversation. However, Sudo was still not willing to give up. He truly wanted to change Ayanokoji's mind. He even reminded everyone that Horikita depended on him greatly, and it was hard to imagine what would happen if one day they had to face Ayanokoji as an enemy. Ike then told Sudo to stop forcing the situation. There was no point in dragging out the argument. Right before they parted ways, Miyake said that even though Ayanokoji had transferred classes, they were still friends. Their study group would always be open if Ayanokoji ever needed help. The next day, Ayanokoji came to school about 30 minutes earlier than usual. He did that on purpose to observe his new class. He wanted to know who arrived the earliest, who came late, who was easy to get along with, and who was more reserved. In short, he wanted to understand the patterns within Class C. However, when Ayanokoji entered the classroom, he realized that the room was not empty. A female student named Shiraishi was already there before him. Coincidentally, her seat was right beside Ayanokoji's. Shiraishi greeted him warmly and explained that she had only happened to come earlier than usual. However, to Ayanokoji, too many coincidences felt suspicious. He began to feel that there might be something behind all of this. Their conversation continued. Shiraishi immediately asked why Ayanokoji had transferred to Class C. Ayanokoji only gave a brief answer, saying that he had come to help the class. However, that answer only made Shiraishi even more confused. To her, there was no clear benefit for Ayanokoji in leaving a class with a higher position. Shiraishi also admitted that there were still many students in Class C who doubted Ayanokoji's abilities. However, Ayanokoji did not think too much about it. He explained that from the very beginning, one of the conditions for his transfer was the approval of all the students in Class C. So even though there were still doubts, they basically still placed their hopes in him. Even so, Shiraishi still had a hard time understanding that decision. In her opinion, students from upper classes usually only transferred to lower classes if they had a major reason or a certain problem, just like what happened with Katsuragi. However, Ayanokoji had no conflict at all with his former class. Because of that, his transfer felt even stranger. In addition, from many people's point of view, Ayanokoji was known as someone who could be relied on greatly. During his time in Horikita's class, he was considered to have played a major role in various exams. That was why the students of Class C were willing to spend so many points to bring him in. On top of that, Hashimoto and Morishita had also worked hard to make that transfer happen. Just as their conversation was starting to become more interesting, Yoshida suddenly arrived. He greeted Ayanokoji warmly and even suggested that Ayanokoji should come early every day so the students could get used to his presence more quickly. Shiraishi immediately felt that the comment sounded a little sarcastic and impolite. However, Yoshida only gave a small laugh and asked them to forget what he had said. Not long after that, Shiraishi asked Yoshida to help Ayanokoji blend in with the other students. As one of the most popular students in the class, Yoshida was considered the most suitable person to do it. At first, Yoshida looked reluctant. However, after Shiraishi kept pressing him, he finally gave in and agreed to help Ayanokoji get to know several students in Class C. A few moments later, the other students began arriving in the classroom. Yoshida immediately kept his distance from Shiraishi and Ayanokoji, as if he did not want to be seen too close to them. Seeing that, Shiraishi calmly told Ayanokoji that Yoshida most likely liked her. According to her, that was the reason Yoshida had agreed to her request earlier. However, Shiraishi immediately made it clear that she had no feelings for Yoshida at all. Even if Yoshida were the last man in the world, she still would not choose him. Time passed. On Saturday, Ayanokoji prepared to go to the gym after Ichinose invited him to work out together. They had agreed to meet at the mall first. However, before he had to wait too long, Hosen from Class 2D suddenly appeared and approached him directly. As usual, Hosen came with a provocative attitude. He mocked Ayanokoji for being foolish enough to transfer from Class A to Class C. Even so, Ayanokoji was not provoked at all. He responded calmly and told Hosen to look for another opponent, such as Ryuen. However, Hosen instead called Ryuen a coward who did not dare to fight one-on-one. Ayanokoji then replied that fighting against many people was actually more interesting. However, instead of turning into a fight, their conversation shifted to the condition of Hosen's class. Ayanokoji mentioned that Hosen's class actually had the potential to rise to Class C. However, Hosen admitted that he did not care. To him, his only job was to collect points, while class matters were left to Nanase. That statement made Ayanokoji a little surprised. However, after thinking about it, he realized that Nanase was indeed more suited to be a leader than Hosen. Hearing that, Hosen immediately became annoyed and once again challenged Ayanokoji to a fight. However, before the situation grew even more heated, Chabashira suddenly appeared and immediately pulled Ayanokoji to a quieter place. Ayanokoji realized that Chabashira had actually been following him since he left the dormitory. In that place, Chabashira once again asked about the reason for his class transfer. Ayanokoji briefly complained because everyone kept asking him the same thing. Chabashira only wanted to make sure that the transfer had not happened because of pressure from anyone. She was worried that something had forced Ayanokoji to leave. However, Ayanokoji immediately calmed her down. He said that the problem with Hoshinomiya no longer needed to be worried about. He even guaranteed that Hoshinomiya would not cause any problems, either for Chabashira or for the school. Hearing that, Chabashira seemed to feel a little guilty. She had thought that Ayanokoji transferred because of a problem related to Hoshinomiya. However, Ayanokoji explained that his desire to transfer had existed long before that conflict happened. From the very beginning, he had already been aiming for Class C or Class D. Ayanokoji also added that Chabashira actually already knew. He had never truly aimed to graduate from Class A. He had his own goal at this school, and that goal would not be achieved if he remained in Horikita's class. However, for now, he was not ready to reveal that goal. Chabashira finally understood that the transfer was not something forced on Ayanokoji, but a choice he had made himself. After that, they parted ways. To sum up, after finishing his workout at the gym with Ichinose, Ayanokoji finally parted ways with her. However, not long after that, Ichinose was approached by Ichika. At first, they only made small talk about activities at the gym. However, little by little, Ichika began steering the conversation toward a more serious topic: Ichinose's closeness with Ayanokoji. Even when she mentioned Ayanokoji's name, Ichika's eyes immediately lit up. She even admitted that she liked Ayanokoji while forming a heart sign with her fingers. Ichinose fell silent for a moment after hearing that confession, slightly surprised. Ichika quickly explained that her feelings for Ayanokoji were not romantic love, but admiration toward a senior. However, a few moments later, she jokingly said that yes, she really did love Ayanokoji. Hearing that, Ichinose remained calm. She even offered to help Ichika get closer to Ayanokoji if that was what Ichika truly wanted. After previously acting cheerful, Ichika suddenly changed the direction of the conversation. This time, she became curious about the relationship between Ichinose and Ayanokoji. According to her, they had recently looked very close, to the point that people could misunderstand them as a couple. Calmly, Ichinose immediately explained that she was not Ayanokoji's girlfriend. However, Ichika did not stop digging for information. In response, Ichinose instead invited Ichika to join them at the gym next time, so she could also get closer to Ayanokoji. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. Ichika's friendly expression faded, and her face became more serious. She accused Ichinose of becoming more arrogant recently. At that moment, Ichika showed another side of herself, changing from a sweet junior into someone blunt and sharp with her words. Her words became even more piercing. Ichika began hinting that Ichinose must have a special relationship with Ayanokoji, even implying something far more intimate. Unexpectedly, Ichinose did not panic and did not deny it excessively. She stayed calm, then said that even though they were not dating, she and Ayanokoji had a strong bond. Hearing that, Ichika immediately laughed. She mocked Ichinose by saying that Ayanokoji was only interested in her physical appeal. Just like Karuizawa before her, Ichika implied that Ichinose would also be thrown away once Ayanokoji got bored. This time, Ichinose's smile began to fade. She answered with a comparison, saying that she was like an expensive cake. A cake that was too delicious, if eaten every day, would eventually start to feel ordinary. However, a luxurious cake that was only enjoyed once in a while would always feel special. Ichika laughed again after hearing that. She then said that Ayanokoji was not an ordinary man. According to her, Ichinose still did not truly know who Ayanokoji was, because there were still many secrets she did not know. However, Ichinose responded casually. She said that she and Ayanokoji had already shared secrets with each other, including something called the White Room. The moment Ichika heard that name, her expression immediately changed. She looked shocked, even slightly panicked. She had never expected Ichinose to know anything about the White Room. In reality, however, Ichinose did not actually know anything. The term White Room was something she had only heard once, when she accidentally overheard the conversation between Tsukishiro and Shiba during the uninhabited island exam. However, this time, Ichinose deliberately mentioned it as a bluff, as if she knew more than she actually did. And surprisingly, that bluff worked. After seeing Ichika's reaction, Ichinose immediately realized that the White Room was something extremely important. She began to suspect that the White Room might be a place, or perhaps even a certain school, and Ichika seemed to have a connection to that place. After gaining that clue, Ichinose said goodbye and left. Meanwhile, Ichika was left behind with a sense of regret. At first, she had only intended to toy with Ichinose, but in the end, she was the one who got baited. She even admitted that facing Ichinose had made her shiver. From that incident, Ichika began to realize one important thing. Ichinose was not an ordinary woman. As Ichika walked away, she kept thinking about whether Ayanokoji had really leaked something about the White Room. Logically, no matter how charming someone was, Ayanokoji was not the kind of man who would easily reveal a secret that big. However, despite all those doubts, Ichika's fighting spirit began to burn. She felt that the class battle in the third year would become far more interesting, and this time, she did not want to waste any more time. Ichika began seriously pursuing her own goal. 1 week after the students entered their third year, Ayanokoji's transfer slowly began to be forgotten by those who did not know him very well. For some people, it was no longer a big issue. However, it was different for the people who truly knew who Ayanokoji really was. They still could not simply accept his departure. One of them was Chiaki, who had now become quieter and rarely smiled. Sudo was also affected. His emotions became unstable, and he even got angry easily over small things. In short, anyone who had once been close to Ayanokoji or had relied on him was still shaken by his departure. Meanwhile, Horikita also still could not fully accept reality. Deep inside her heart, there were still many questions that continued to bother her. Why did Ayanokoji choose to leave? Was it because she was too weak? Or was it because Ayanokoji had grown tired of protecting her all this time? Because she felt lost, Horikita became determined to no longer depend on Ayanokoji. She wanted to live her high school life more calmly. However, in truth, that determination appeared precisely because she still could not imagine life without Ayanokoji's presence. All this time, her confidence had always come from the person who had secretly supported her from behind. And now, when that support disappeared, Horikita began to doubt every step she took. A few moments later, Chabashira called Horikita's name. Apparently, Horikita had not been paying attention to the explanation about the new exam. To sum up, they would be facing a class battle, and Horikita's Class A would fight against Ichinose's Class D. In her heart, Horikita felt a little relieved because she did not have to fight the class where Ayanokoji was now. However, she also realized that this exam would not be easy. Academically, Ichinose's class was clearly superior. In addition, Horikita's class had already lost several members and only had 36 students left, while Ichinose's class was still complete with 40 students. Horikita tried to focus on building a strategy, but her mind kept returning to Ayanokoji. Usually, in a situation like this, she would ask for his opinion. However, now, she had to think about everything by herself. That pressure felt so heavy that it made it difficult for her to breathe. Suddenly, Sudo touched Horikita's shoulder and asked if she was all right. Horikita tried to stay calm, then said that she was only thinking about a strategy. However, Sudo knew that was not the real reason. He realized that Horikita was trying to carry everything by herself. Because of that, Sudo tried to calm her down. He said that responsibility did not have to be carried alone, because a class did not depend on only one person. Not long after that, the strategy discussion among the students began. On the other hand, in Ayanokoji's class, Mashima was explaining the system and rules of the upcoming exam. After the explanation ended, Hashimoto suddenly stood up and said that this was the perfect moment for Ayanokoji to prove himself as a leader. Shimazaki seemed doubtful because he was worried that such a decision might instead lead them to defeat. However, Hashimoto remained confident. He was sure that Ayanokoji would not fail. Ayanokoji himself did not immediately promise victory. He only said that if the class chose him as the leader, then he would do his best. Even so, Shimazaki had a different view. According to him, their class was already strong enough academically to win without having to appoint a special leader. With only a normal discussion, they should be able to get through this exam. The strategy discussion continued. Sanada then proposed a fairly reasonable idea. He suggested that Ayanokoji should try to predict which students Ryuen's class might send in the minority battle exam. If they could guess the lineup from the beginning, they would only need to place the most suitable students to face them. Sanada also agreed that this exam did not always require a leader. However, in the long run, their class still needed someone they could rely on. Because of that, this exam could become a small opportunity to see how far Ayanokoji could prove himself. Ayanokoji responded calmly. He said that if he was truly given that role, he would do his best. Shimazaki finally agreed, because this exam could also become a kind of personal test for Ayanokoji. To sum up, Ayanokoji, Hashimoto, and Morishita went to a cafe to discuss their strategy further. There, the atmosphere became a little lighter when Morishita looked confused while choosing a drink. She even said that she needed 1 hour to decide. Hashimoto naturally protested right away. However, Morishita only chuckled because it turned out that she was only joking. Casually, she said that she needed to consult with her stomach first to find out what drink she truly wanted. Meanwhile, Ayanokoji himself still had a hard time understanding Morishita's way of thinking. Even so, their conversation continued until Morishita suddenly suggested that they call Yamamura. With her usual way of speaking, Morishita described Yamamura as oxygen that was thinner than carbon dioxide. What she meant was that Yamamura's presence was almost unnoticeable, as if she existed only to be used without ever being truly acknowledged. Once again, Morishita showed her unique way of speaking, filled with strange comparisons. Ayanokoji then explained that he had actually already spoken with Yamamura and asked her to keep her distance. However, behind that request, Ayanokoji had another purpose. He was using Yamamura as a spy, so her presence needed to be hidden and used quietly. Hashimoto then said that he had not expected a one-on-one exam like this to appear so quickly at the beginning of the year. On the other hand, he felt slightly relieved because they did not have to fight Ichinose's class. After all, because of their alliance, if they faced Ichinose's class, they would have to lose on purpose. The discussion continued. Ayanokoji admitted that he still could not decide on a definite strategy. He also did not intend to participate in the minority battle, because Ryuen would almost certainly target him immediately. Even so, Ayanokoji planned to speak directly with Ryuen, because he was sure that Ryuen would appear soon. And just as expected, not long after that, Ryuen arrived with his group. Apparently, they had already sent observers from the beginning to watch Ayanokoji's meeting from a distance. Ayanokoji had even noticed a suspicious first-year student around the area. From the way they recorded the conversation, he immediately knew that they had been sent by Ryuen. As soon as he arrived, Ishizaki immediately called out to Ayanokoji in a loud voice and questioned the reason for his transfer to Class C. Hashimoto briefly tried to hold them back, but the atmosphere still became heated for a moment. Ryuen then asked about the real reason behind Ayanokoji's transfer. Ayanokoji only answered that Class C needed his help after losing Sakayanagi. However, Ishizaki clearly did not believe him that easily. Unlike Ishizaki, Ryuen actually looked pleased. To him, Ayanokoji had finally come to the surface and started playing an important role in a class. The real battle would only have meaning if Ayanokoji truly led a class. However, Ryuen also knew that Ayanokoji's position as a leader had not been fully recognized yet. Time and proof were still needed. Ayanokoji admitted that and hoped Ryuen would act reasonably in the upcoming exam. However, Ryuen only smiled cynically. To him, this was the perfect time to prove everything, and there would be no mercy. After that, Ryuen prepared to leave. However, Ishizaki was still grumbling. He was annoyed because Ayanokoji had chosen to transfer to Class C, even though he had invited him to join their class several times in the past. But now, everything was already too late. In the end, Ryuen and his group left the place. Meanwhile, Hashimoto truly hoped that Ayanokoji would not lose. From the way Ryuen had spoken earlier, it was clear that this battle would not proceed normally. Everything would be far more serious than they had imagined. On the other hand, Kushida still seemed isolated as usual. Ever since her true personality was exposed, her relationship with her classmates had become worse. Many people began keeping their distance from her, and she no longer interacted with them much. Even so, Kushida could still act normally when dealing with students from other classes. While she was alone, Kushida saw Horikita sitting with a gloomy expression. Actually, she could have ignored her. However, this time, Kushida stopped and approached her. She guessed that Horikita was waiting for Ayanokoji to pass by. In a sarcastic tone, Kushida said that Horikita looked like someone who had just lost her love. According to her, Horikita depended too much on Ayanokoji. When Horikita told her to leave, Kushida refused. After all, Horikita was the class leader. If the leader looked that pathetic, the entire class would also look bad. Suddenly, Kushida's expression turned friendly when Yui from Class 3D passed by and greeted them. However, once Yui left, that smile immediately disappeared, and Kushida returned to showing her true nature. Horikita then asked whether Kushida was not bothered by Ayanokoji's transfer. Honestly, Kushida answered that of course she was bothered. Without Ayanokoji, her chances of graduating from Class A felt even more difficult. That answer surprised Horikita. She did not understand how Kushida could still look so calm, even though she was clearly bothered. However, Kushida only explained that she was already used to hiding her emotions. She was very skilled at it, so she could appear calm, even when she was actually irritated. Kushida then teased Horikita, saying that her face looked far too gloomy and unlike her usual self. From their conversation, it was revealed that Horikita usually cooked for Kushida and Ibuki. However, now, all of that had stopped. Horikita no longer had the energy to do something like that, and she was even reluctant to answer phone calls from Ibuki. Kushida then reminded Horikita that, as the class leader, she carried a great responsibility. The class depended on her, especially with the exam about to begin soon. However, after seeing Horikita still drowning in sadness, Kushida finally gave up and chose to leave. Before leaving, Kushida emphasized one thing. There was no point in waiting for Ayanokoji. According to her, Ayanokoji no longer cared about Horikita. Those words felt like a harsh slap. Even though they were bitter, deep inside her heart, Horikita knew that Kushida's words might be true. She began to feel guilty toward her classmates, who had been worrying about her all this time. After that, Horikita returned to her room. She could only lie down while trying to come up with a strategy. However, no matter how hard she tried, the image of Ayanokoji still would not leave her mind. When her phone rang, Horikita briefly hoped that the message was from Ayanokoji. However, it turned out to be only a message from Ibuki, who, as usual, was asking her to cook something. Horikita did not reply. She truly did not have the energy to do anything. A few moments later, another message came in. This time, it was from Hirata, who wanted to discuss the exam. However, instead of replying to him, Horikita began to cry. All the emotions she had been holding back finally overflowed. She still could not accept the reality that Ayanokoji was no longer by her side. Meanwhile, a completely different atmosphere could be felt in the karaoke room. There, Ryuen, Ishizaki, Katsuragi, Albert, and Ibuki were holding a strategy meeting for the exam. Since this exam was academic in nature, they realized that it would be a major challenge for their class. Ibuki openly suggested that they should simply give up. According to her, losing 100 class points was not a big problem. Besides, there was no instant way to suddenly become academically superior. Even without Sakayanagi, Class C was still far stronger than their class. Hearing that, Ishizaki looked frustrated. He had thought Class C would lose its direction after Sakayanagi left. However, in reality, they now had Ayanokoji instead, and that made them feel far more intimidating. Ishizaki still did not understand why Ayanokoji had chosen to transfer to Class C. Ryuen explained that he was actually happy about that transfer. To him, this was a great opportunity, because from the very beginning, his main target had always been Ayanokoji. On the other hand, Katsuragi still did not understand why so many people paid attention to Ayanokoji. Based on his observation, Ayanokoji was still below Sakayanagi. However, Ishizaki tried to understand that point of view, because Katsuragi still did not truly know who Ayanokoji really was. They briefly discussed the possible reason behind Ayanokoji's transfer. However, Ryuen was not interested at all. To Ryuen, the upcoming exam was far more important. The strategy discussion then began. Ryuen revealed a shocking plan. He would use 15 million private points in this exam. Everyone was immediately shocked. However, Ryuen emphasized that even that amount might still not be enough. According to him, the more money they spent, the greater their chances of winning would be. Of course, such a major decision required the approval of the entire class. Ryuen explained that if they agreed to carry out this insane plan, then the entire class had to be ready to accept that failure was not an option. If they lost, bankruptcy would definitely be waiting for them. However, Ibuki disagreed. According to her, it would be better for them to just give up. Even if they won, the class points they gained would not be worth the money they spent. So to her, that plan was not worth it at all. Ryuen actually understood that logic. However, he saw this exam as a golden opportunity to shake Class C. Right now, Class C was extremely confident because the exam was academic in nature. Precisely because of that, if they lost, the blow would be enormous. On top of that, they had already spent a lot of points to recruit Ayanokoji. To Ryuen, this victory would be worth it if it could destroy Class C's mental state. Ryuen also asked Ibuki about Horikita's condition, because they used to eat together quite often. However, Ibuki looked annoyed and said that Horikita had now become distant and closed off. They no longer interacted like they used to. Hearing that, Ryuen immediately concluded that Class A would most likely struggle in the upcoming exam. At this point, Ryuen finally decided on his next move. He realized that Ayanokoji was aiming for victory in order to prove that he was worthy of leading the class. Because of that, Class C now had great expectations for him. Ryuen's strategy was very clear. Their main target was not simply to win, but to bring Ayanokoji down. If Ayanokoji failed in this exam, then Class C's trust in him would collapse. That way, they would not need to bother defeating the entire class. They only needed to make Ayanokoji lose his position. Ryuen was also confident that Ayanokoji would not be able to accurately predict which students from Class B would be sent to the minority battle. Because of that, by following Ryuen's instructions, Class B agreed. Their mission was to make Ayanokoji fall and make Class C lose trust in him. To sum up, on a day off, Ayanokoji went to the mall to meet several of his classmates. He wanted to build a better relationship with them. This time, he planned to meet Yoshida and Shiraishi, with the meeting point set in front of the dormitory. When Ayanokoji arrived, Yoshida immediately greeted him. It turned out that Yoshida had arrived much earlier, even waiting for 1 hour. Casually, he said that as a gentleman, he could not possibly let a woman arrive before him. Because he had learned many things about love from Karuizawa, Ayanokoji began to understand the hidden meanings behind someone's actions. So, after seeing Yoshida's attitude, he immediately suspected Yoshida's feelings towards Shiraishi. Without hesitation, Ayanokoji directly asked whether Yoshida liked Shiraishi. Yoshida instantly panicked and denied it nervously. However, from his reaction alone, Ayanokoji could already confirm that those feelings did exist. In fact, because he was too nervous, Yoshida even turned the accusation back on Ayanokoji, saying that Ayanokoji had transferred to their class because he liked Shiraishi. Of course, Ayanokoji denied that accusation. However, since Yoshida still looked doubtful, he quickly changed the topic. Ayanokoji explained that the purpose of this meeting was not romance, but to understand the class situation and get to know the students better. In short, this was part of his strategy, not a matter of love. In the middle of the conversation, they briefly talked about Hashimoto. Not long after that, Nishikawa, Shiraishi's close friend, appeared. Her arrival seemed to make Yoshida a little annoyed. In a teasing tone, Nishikawa immediately made a sarcastic remark, as if Ayanokoji was on a date with Shiraishi. Ayanokoji calmly explained that there was no such intention. However, Nishikawa then warned them not to get too close to Shiraishi, because Shiraishi had a lot of experience. Yoshida and Ayanokoji were naturally confused. Then, Nishikawa explained that Shiraishi had quite a shocking nickname, which was the Conqueror of 100 Men. Hearing that, Yoshida's expression immediately changed. He looked shaken, even though he tried hard to hide it. Meanwhile, Ayanokoji briefly remembered Morishita's song about 100 friends and asked whether it was related. However, Nishikawa explained that the nickname was only a figure of speech. Shiraishi had indeed been close to many men, but that did not mean she had actually been in relationships with 100 people. Nishikawa then teased Yoshida, guessing that he must be very disappointed. Yoshida immediately denied it and said that he had never liked Shiraishi. However, Nishikawa only smiled, then joked that if Yoshida knelt before Shiraishi, perhaps she might consider a one-night love with him. The innocent Yoshida immediately looked happy after hearing that. His reaction made Nishikawa laugh, because a joke like that was apparently very easy for him to believe. Meanwhile, Ayanokoji instead became curious about whether Shiraishi's nickname would change into the Conqueror of 200 Men if her experience increased. However, Nishikawa explained that it was all just a metaphor. No matter how large the number became, her nickname would remain the same, the Conqueror of Men. After that rather exhausting conversation, Yoshida seemed to lose his motivation. He went away for a moment to look for a seat, leaving only Ayanokoji and Nishikawa to continue the conversation. According to Nishikawa, there were usually two types of men who reacted to Shiraishi's reputation as the Conqueror of 100 Men. The first type would become gloomy and disappointed, while the second type would become even more interested in a rather uncomfortable way. Because of that, Nishikawa wanted to know what Ayanokoji thought. However, as usual, Ayanokoji's answer was different from most people's. He instead said that he respected Shiraishi. According to him, the ability to build good relationships with so many people was something incredible. To Ayanokoji, it was a social skill that deserved to be acknowledged. After hearing that answer, Nishikawa only smiled. She then whispered that perhaps Shiraishi wanted to make Ayanokoji the 101st man. That was the reason Shiraishi was willing to spend her day off with Ayanokoji. However, according to Nishikawa, all of it was only for fun, not something serious. Ayanokoji immediately rejected that assumption. He explained that if he looked too close to Shiraishi, rumors would definitely spread and reach Yoshida's ears. He did not want one small decision today to interfere with his goal of helping Class C rise in rank. After hearing that, Nishikawa narrowed her eyes and said that she would have to reevaluate her impression of Ayanokoji. Not long after that, Shiraishi finally arrived and greeted them all. She looked happy to spend her day off with Ayanokoji, and of course, with Yoshida as well. However, when she saw Yoshida looking quiet, Shiraishi immediately teased him for seeming unmotivated. Yoshida only complained softly, feeling that he was once again being treated like a side character. Then, Nishikawa took over and decided their destination, which was karaoke. Once they arrived there, she immediately handed the microphone to Yoshida and told him to sing first. Yoshida naturally protested because he did not really like singing. However, after Nishikawa whispered something to him, Yoshida's mood changed drastically. With new enthusiasm, he began singing with great energy. While Yoshida was completely absorbed in his song, Shiraishi slowly moved closer to Ayanokoji. Now, their positions were extremely close, almost without any distance between them. In his heart, Ayanokoji realized that Shiraishi was using her man-conquering technique. Shiraishi then said that she wanted to talk more privately with Ayanokoji. Their conversation began to flow naturally until Yoshida's song finally ended. As soon as Yoshida saw Shiraishi and Ayanokoji sitting too close together, he was immediately shocked. Nishikawa quickly reacted. She grabbed Yoshida's hand and told him to sing another song, clearly trying to distract him. Meanwhile, Shiraishi asked to exchange contact information with Ayanokoji. Ayanokoji gladly accepted, because after all, they were classmates. Even so, he still felt confused. Shiraishi could act very friendly toward him, while most of the other students still kept their distance. Shiraishi casually answered that it was because their seats were right next to each other. To her, their meeting in the morning while the school was still quiet felt like fate. Ayanokoji did not truly understand why something like that was considered fate. However, before he could answer, Shiraishi suddenly held his hand gently and praised him, saying that Ayanokoji's hand felt very smooth. Ayanokoji immediately pulled his hand away, then calmly said that he did not want Yoshida to misunderstand. So, that was the recap of Part 2 from Volume 1 of the light novel Classroom of the Elite Year 3. In this part, Ayanokoji's transfer to Class C began to show its major impact, from Horikita still being shaken, Class A losing its direction, to Ryuen starting to make Ayanokoji his main target in the next exam. For now, it feels like there is nothing more that needs to be explained, because everything is already clear. So, just wait for the continuation in the next part.